"I've never been kissed," she said. And the giant Apache touched her face and said, "Trust me." It started on a snow-blown mountain pass, where a rancher's sheltered daughter lay trapped beneath a wrecked wagon rescued by the very man her father swore was the enemy. But in the cold firelight of a cave, one secret promise would spark a storm no blizzard could match, because the railroad is coming, and a single map in the Apache's hands could save her family's land or destroy it forever. In a town where every handshake hides a knife, one word in court could clear his name or cost her everything she's ever known. As church bells toll and hooves thunder on frozen ground, her heart and honor hang in the balance. Will she defy her father, face the town, and stand beside the man who risked it all for her, or lose him and the land forever? Every story begins with a heartbeat. Tell me, where are you in the world today, and how are you really doing? Your words make this space feel more human. The icy wind howled through the mountain pass, cutting through Clara Bennett's woolen coat like needles. She gripped the wagon seat, her knuckles white beneath her mittens as the supply wagon creaked and swayed beneath her. Her father Amos sat rigid beside her, his weathered hands tight on the reins as he guided their team through the treacherous mountain trail. The narrow path wound between towering cliffs streaked with ice and snow. Clara's breath came out in white puffs as she tried to still her trembling. 6 months of isolation at the ranch hadn't prepared her for this bitter journey to Silver Falls for winter supplies. A sharp crack split the air as a snow-laden branch gave way overhead. The horses reared in panic, their hooves scrambling on the icy ground. Clara felt the wagon lurch sideways as her father fought to control the team. "Hold on," Amos shouted, but it was too late. The wagon tilted, then toppled with a sickening crash. Clara was thrown clear, landing hard in a snowbank. Sharp pain shot through her leg as one of the heavy wagon wheels pinned her down. "Pa!" she called out, but the howling wind swallowed her voice. Through the swirling snow, she could make out her father's still form several yards away. The cold began seeping into her bones as she lay trapped, unable to free herself. Time seemed to blur as numbness spread through her body. The storm raged on, and Clara's thoughts grew sluggish. Just as her eyes began to close, a massive shadow emerged from the white fury of the blizzard. A figure wrapped in a buffalo robe loomed over her, dark eyes studying her predicament. It was Dakota, the Apache horse trainer she'd glimpsed occasionally, working with wild horses near their ranch boundary. Without a word, he assessed the situation, then braced himself against the wagon wheel. With careful strength, he lifted the wheel just enough for Clara to drag herself free. Her leg throbbed, but nothing seemed broken. Dakota quickly wrapped his buffalo robe around her shivering form, then scooped her up in his arms as if she weighed nothing. "Your father?" he asked, his voice deep and steady against the storm's fury. "Over there," Clara managed through chattering teeth, pointing to where she'd last seen Amos. Dakota carried her to a shallow cave cut into the cliff face, setting her down gently. "Stay here," he commanded, then disappeared back into the storm. Minutes later, he returned supporting a dazed but conscious Amos Bennett. Working swiftly, Dakota gathered dry wood from his pack animals and built a fire in the cave's shelter. The flames caught quickly, sending welcome warmth through the space. He tended to Amos's head wound with quiet efficiency, then checked Clara's leg. His touch professional and respectful. As the fire crackled and popped, Clara found herself studying Dakota's face in the dancing light. His features were strong, dignified, with eyes that held both wisdom and kindness. She'd never been this close to him before, had never noticed how gentle his hands could be despite their obvious strength. The storm raged outside their shelter, but within the cave, time seemed to slow. Amos had drifted into an uneasy sleep, his breathing steady. Clara huddled in the buffalo robe, breathing in its musky leather scent mixed with something else, sage, perhaps, or sweet grass. "I've never been kissed," Clara whispered, surprising herself with the confession. The words seemed to float in the firelit air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Dakota's dark eyes met hers across the flames. He moved closer, slowly, deliberately, as if approaching a nervous colt. His hand rose to her cheek, calloused fingers warm against her skin. "Trust me," he said quietly, his voice low and reassuring. Clara felt something shift inside her chest. Not fear, but a warm flutter of anticipation. but Dakota didn't move to kiss her. Instead, his thumb brushed gently across her cheekbone in a gesture of comfort and promise. "You are safe here," he added, his words carrying the weight of an oath. They shared the warmth of the fire and the buffalo robe through the long night, speaking little but communicating volumes in shared glances and careful movements. Dakota told her about his pack horses, about reading weather in the clouds, about his people's ways with the land. Clara found herself speaking of her own life, the lonely months at the ranch, her father's protective strictness, her secret dreams of something more. As dawn approached, the storm's fury finally began to ease. Dakota rose and went to check on his horses, then returned to prepare for their journey down to town. He moved with quiet efficiency, checking Amos's wound again and helping Clara test her injured leg. "Can you ride?" he asked, leading forward. One of his gentler mares. Clara nodded, knowing the wagon was beyond repair for now. Her father was still unsteady, but alert enough to mount another of Dakota's horses. As the first rays of sun broke through the clouds, they began their careful descent toward Silver Falls, leaving the wreckage of the wagon behind until it could be retrieved later. Clara's leg ached, but she found herself focusing instead on the steady presence of Dakota riding beside her, his buffalo robe still wrapped warmly around her shoulders. Something had changed during that storm-bound night, something profound and precious that she tucked away in her heart. Like a seed waiting to grow. The descent from the mountain pass was treacherous, each step measured against the ice-slick trail. Dakota led their small party with careful precision, one hand steady on his horse's reins while the other guided Amos Bennett's mount. Clara sat behind Dakota, her injured leg bound with strips of clean cloth from his saddlebag. The buffalo robe remained wrapped around her shoulders, its familiar warmth now a comfort against more than just the cold. Wind whistled through the pines as they picked their way down. Clara could feel the powerful muscles of Dakota's horse moving beneath them, sure-footed despite the dangerous conditions. Her father swayed slightly in his saddle, the cloth around his head showing spots of red, but his jaw was set in that familiar stubborn line she knew so well. The sun hung low in the western sky by the time the first buildings of Silver Falls came into view. Smoke rose from chimneys and thin gray columns against the darkening clouds. Clara felt Dakota tense slightly as they approached the town proper. Though his posture remained proud and dignified, people began emerging from shops and houses as they rode down the main street. Clara heard the whispers start, saw the pointing fingers and wide eyes. A Bennett girl pressed against an Apache's back. She felt her cheeks flush but kept her chin high, remembering the gentle strength of his hands when he'd rescued her. "Land's sakes," came a woman's voice from the mercantile porch. "Is that Amos Bennett's girl?" They stopped in front of Ma Harper's boarding house, its weather-worn sign creaking in the wind. Dakota dismounted first, then turned to help Clara down with careful hands. Her leg protested as she put weight on it, but she managed to stand straight. Sheriff Miller appeared from the saloon across the street, his hand resting near his gun belt as he watched them. "Pa needs attention," Clara said quickly, gesturing to her father. "He hit his head when the wagon overturned." Amos Bennett practically fell from his saddle, though he batted away Dakota's offered help. The older man's face had grown thunderous, his earlier confusion giving way to something darker as he took in the gathered crowd. "We're much obliged for the assist," Amos ground out, the words clearly costing him. Then his voice hardened. "But you'd best be on your way now. We don't need any more of your meddling." Clara's heart clenched at her father's tone. "Pa, he saved our lives." "Without Dakota," inside Clara. Amos cut her off, his voice brooking no argument. "Now." Dakota stood very still, his face impassive though something flickered in his dark eyes. He gave a slight nod, first to Amos, then to Clara. Without a word, he mounted his horse and turned back toward the trail, the buffalo robe still wrapped around Clara's shoulders. Ma Harper herself helped Clara inside, clucking over her injury and Amos's wound. The boarding house's main room was warm, heated by a pot-bellied stove where several men huddled, talking in low voices. Clara sank into a chair near them, her leg throbbing, as Ma Harper led her father upstairs to tend his head. "Railroad's gonna put up a fight," one of the men was saying, warming his hands over the stove. He wore an expensive coat, though, Trail. Dust covered his boots. "That Bennett spread's right where the track needs to run." Clara's ears pricked up, though she kept her eyes lowered to her lap. "Won't matter much," his companion replied, a lean man with a cavalry mustache. Word is, their deed's got problems. Won't hold up once the lawyers get involved. Railroad's got deeper pockets than some stubborn rancher. Clara's pulse quickened at their words. She knew every inch of the Bennett ranch, every creek and hill her father had built up from nothing. The thought of losing it to the railroad made her stomach clench. Them Indians won't fare much better, the first man added with a harsh laugh. Treaty land or no. Later that night, Clara lay in the narrow boarding-house bed, listening to the storm's fury dying outside. The buffalo robe was folded carefully beside her, its presence both comfort and question. Her father slept in the next room, his snores muffled by the wall between them. She thought of Tekota's quiet strength, the way he'd known exactly how to calm the horses on that treacherous trail. He lived on the reservation lands that bordered Bennett Ranch to the north. If the railroad was threatening both their homes. Sleep proved elusive as her mind worked. She knew her father planned to leave as soon as his head wound allowed, probably tomorrow. But already she was thinking of ways to see Tekota again, to learn what he might know about the railroad's plans. The moon broke briefly through the clouds outside her window, casting silver light across the buffalo robe. Clara touched its worn surface, remembering Tekota's words in the cave, "Trust me." Despite her father's anger, despite the townspeople's stares, she knew she did trust him. Now she just had to figure out how to warn him about what she'd overheard. Morning sunlight glinted off. Fresh snow as Clara made her way down Silver Falls Main Street. Each step was a careful negotiation with her bruised leg, but the town's doctor had assured her nothing was broken. She clutched her father's supply list in one gloved hand, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. The mercantile's worn wooden steps creaked under her boots. She paused at the top, her heart skipping as she spotted a familiar figure across the street. Tekota stood beside the livery stable, checking the hooves of a magnificent bay horse. Even from this distance, she could see the gentleness in his movements, the way the horse trusted him completely. Another man stood with him, older, his silver hair bound back with a leather cord. They spoke in low voices, the unfamiliar syllables of Apache flowing between them. Clara hesitated, one hand on the mercantile's door. She shouldn't eavesdrop, but something held her in place. The old treaty map, Tekota said in English, his deep voice carrying across the quiet street. The older man, his uncle, perhaps, shook his head, responding in Apache. Clara couldn't make out more before the mercantile's bell jangled, startling her as another customer pushed past. Inside, the store smelled of coffee beans, leather, and tobacco. Mr. Peterson nodded from behind the counter as she handed over her father's list. While he gathered the items, Clara tried to focus on checking each one, but her thoughts kept drifting to Tekota and the mysterious map. "That'll be $4.28, Miss Bennett, mister," Peterson said, breaking into her thoughts. She counted out the money carefully, watching through the window as Tekota's uncle walked away. Leaving the younger man to load supplies into his saddlebags, Clara gathered her courage along with her purchases. The bell announced her exit as she stepped back into the morning chill. Tekota looked up at the sound, his expression carefully neutral as she approached. "Good morning," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I wanted to thank you properly for saving my life yesterday." Tekota secured a final strap on his saddle before turning to face her. "No thanks needed. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Clara said firmly. "They wouldn't have. Most would have ridden past, especially in that storm." She took a deep breath. "I heard you mention a treaty map just now." What? Tekota's shoulders stiffened. Such matters are not for Bennett ears. His tone was polite but final, all trace of yesterday's warmth gone. "But if it has to do with the railroad coming through, Clara Bennett." Her father's voice cracked like a whip across the street. Amos Bennett strode toward them, his bandaged head making him look even more fearsome than usual. His hand gripped Clara's arm, pulling her back from Tekota. "What did I tell you about staying away from him?" "Pa, please." Clara tried to pull free, but her father's grip only tightened. "You listen good now," Amos growled at Tekota. "Stay away from my daughter. Your kind ain't welcome around Bennett land or Bennett kin. We clear?" Tekota's face remained impassive, though something dangerous flickered in his eyes. He gave a single nod, mounted his horse with fluid grace, and rode away without another word. Clara watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You're forbidden to speak to that Indian again," Amos said, finally releasing her arm. "Do you understand me, girl?" Clara nodded mutely, but inside, determination bloomed like a winter rose. Her father might forbid it, but she couldn't forget the gentle way Dakota had tended her wounds, or the mystery of the treaty map he'd mentioned. Something was happening that threatened both their lands, and she meant to find out what. The rest of the day passed in tense silence as they prepared for tomorrow's journey home. Clara helped Ma Harper cook supper, packed their remaining supplies, and mended a tear in her heavy coat. But her thoughts kept drifting to the livery stable, where a dim light burned late into the evening. Standing at the boarding house window, Clara watched that distant glow and made a silent vow. Whatever her father said, whatever proper Silver Falls society thought, she would find a way to learn the truth. Too much was at stake: her family's ranch, Dakota's people's lands, and something else she wasn't quite ready to name that maid. Her heart beat faster whenever she thought of dark eyes and gentle hands. Dawn painted the sky in pale streaks as they loaded the wagon the next morning. The snow-packed roads promised a slow journey home, but at least the storm had passed. Clara settled onto the hard seat beside her father, tucking the buffalo robe around her legs. She hadn't found a way to return it to Tiko. As the wagon rolled out of Silver Falls. Clara kept her eyes fixed ahead, not daring to look back. But she could feel the town receding behind them, taking with it the mystery of the treaty map and the man who had saved her life. For now, the Bennett Ranch appeared through the swirling snow just as the winter sun began to sink. Clara's heart lifted at the sight of home, the frost-rimed fence posts standing like sentinels, thin blue smoke curling from the kitchen chimney into the pearl-gray sky. The familiar sweep of the land, even buried under its white blanket, spoke of safety and routine. The wagon wheels crunched through fresh powder as they approached the house. Clara's leg had stiffened during the long ride, making each bump and jolt a fresh reminder of her accident. Still, she couldn't help but remember the gentle way Dakota had bound her injuries, his careful hand so different from his warrior's bearing. May Bennett hurried out onto the front porch, wrapping her shawl tight against the wind. Land's sake, I've been worried sick. She helped Clara down from the wagon, clucking her tongue at the sight of the bandages. "Inside with you now. Let me have a proper look at that leg." "I'm fine, Ma," Clara protested, but allowed herself to be steered toward the warmth of the kitchen. Behind them, she heard her father giving instructions to the ranch hands about unloading the supplies. May settled Clara in the cushioned chair by the stove, unwrapping the bandages with practiced care. Her stepmother's hands were gentle as she examined the bruising, but her eyes were sharp with concern. "Tell me true now, how bad was it up there? In that pass?" Before Clara could answer, Amos's heavy boots sounded on the porch. He stepped into the kitchen, stamping snow from his feet. "Don't go filling her head with wild notions about that rescue, May. What's done is done." May's lips tightened, but she said nothing, reaching for the tin of healing salve on the shelf. Clara watched her father hang his coat by the door, noting how his shoulders remained tense, his movements jerky with unspoken anger, the kitchen filled with familiar evening sounds as May prepared supper, the crack and sizzle of fat in the pan, the soft thump of dough being kneaded, the rattle of the stove door as she added another log. The normality of it all made the memory of the storm seem almost dreamlike, but Clara's aching leg reminded her otherwise. "South pasture fence needs shoring up before spring thaw," Amos muttered, more to himself than anyone else as they sat down to eat. He stabbed at his potatoes with unusual force. "Can't afford any weak spots, not with those railroad surveyors sniffing around like hungry coyotes." Clara's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. The words from Silver Falls echoed in her mind then. At the stove, talking about the railroad's plans for Bennett land. She glanced at her father, wondering if he knew how serious the threat might be. May tried to lighten the mood, asking about the supplies they'd managed to purchase, but Amos answered in grunts, his mind clearly elsewhere. Clara pushed her food around her plate, thinking of the treaty map Dakota had mentioned. Could it have something to do with the railroad's plans? After helping May clear the table, Clara retreated to her room. The small space was cold, but she barely noticed as she pulled out paper and pen from her desk drawer. Her hand trembled slightly as she began to write, "Dear Dakota, I never properly thanked you for saving my life in the pass. Your kindness meant more than I can say. There are matters I need to discuss with you about the railroad and the treaty map you mentioned. Please meet with me when you can. Clara. Bennett, she folded the note carefully, tucking it into her dress pocket. Getting it to him would be tricky. Her father's words about staying away from his kind still rang in her ears. But Clara knew several ranch hands made regular trips to Silver Falls for supplies and mail. Surely one of them would help her. Morning brought fresh snow and opportunity. Sam, one of their most trusted hands, was loading the wagon with empty feed sacks to take to the livery stable in town. Clara watched from the kitchen window until she saw her father ride out to check the north fence line. Pulling on her heavy coat, she hurried out to the barn, trying not to limp too obviously. Sam looked up from securing the last rope, his weathered face creasing in a smile. Morning, Miss Clara. Good to see you up and about. Sam, she said quietly, glancing toward the house. Would you do something for me? It's important. He waited, patient as always, while she pulled out the folded note. Could you deliver this to Dakota at the livery stable? Please don't let anyone else see it. Sam's eyebrows rose slightly, but he took the note without comment, tucking it securely in his shirt pocket. Consider it done, Miss Clara. His kind eyes held no judgment, only understanding. Thank you, she whispered, relief flooding through her. Sam nodded and climbed up onto the wagon seat, clicking to the horses. Clara watched until the wagon disappeared into the swirling snow, wondering if she'd done the right thing. By evening, the storm had intensified. Clara sat by her bedroom window, watching fat flakes dance in the lamplight. Somewhere out there, her note was making its way toward Dakota, or perhaps had already reached him. She pressed her hand against the cold glass, remembering the warmth of the buffalo robe around her shoulders, the trust in his voice when he'd promised to keep her safe. The wind moaned around the eaves of the house, carrying with it all her doubts and hopes. Would Dakota respond? And if he did, what truths would she discover about the railroad's plans for their land? Clara drew her shawl tighter, watching the darkness deepen beyond the window, waiting for an answer that might never come. The morning dawned bright and cold 3 days after Sam's return from town. Frost sparkled on every fence post and branch, the winter sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered yard. Clara pulled her woolen coat tighter as she stepped out into the crisp air, her breath forming white clouds in front of her face. Going to check the stock pond ice, she called, toward the kitchen window where May stood kneading bread. It wasn't entirely a lie. The cattle did need fresh water chopped through the ice, but her heart quickened at the real reason for her early start. The barn doors creaked as she pushed them open, the familiar sense of hay and leather greeting her. Sam stood in the shadows by the tack room, his weathered face breaking into a slight smile as she approached. Without a word, he pressed a folded scrap of paper into her palm. Clara's fingers trembled as she opened Dakota's reply. His handwriting was careful and precise, each letter formed with deliberate strokes. Meet at the old mission by the river bend 3 days hence. She quickly tucked the note into her apron pocket, nodding her thanks to Sam, who disappeared into the morning chores as silently as he'd appeared. The next 3 days crawled by like molasses in winter. Clara threw herself into her duties, churning butter, mending clothes, helping May preserve the last of the fall vegetables. She kept her head down whenever her father was around, avoiding his sharp gaze. Each night, she lay awake in her narrow bed, fingering the hidden note and planning her escape to the mission. On the appointed morning, Clara rose before dawn. She dressed warmly, layers of wool against the biting cold. May was already in the kitchen, stoking the stove fire. I'm heading out to gather dried cattails, Clara said, keeping her voice steady. We're running low for the kitchen brooms. May paused, giving her a long look. Something knowing flickered in her stepmother's eyes, but she simply nodded. Mind your back before dark. Storm clouds are building up north. The stable was quiet as Clara saddled her Mari Penny. The horse's breath came out in white puffs. As Clara led her into the pale morning light, she mounted carefully, mindful of her still tender leg, and pointed Penny's nose toward the river. The ride was peaceful, broken only by the crunch of hooves through crusty snow and the occasional call of a winter bird. Clara's cheeks stung from the cold, but excitement kept her warm inside. As she approached the river bend, the old mission stone walls came into view, standing stark against the winter-bare trees. Dakota was already there, his broad figure leaning against a tumbled wall. His dark hair was pulled back with a leather tie, and he wore a heavy wool coat over his usual clothes. A strong horse stamped nearby, steam rising from its flanks. Clara's heart jumped as she drew closer. She hadn't seen him since that night in the storm, yet the memory of his gentle hands binding her injury remained vivid. She reined Penny to a stop and dismounted, suddenly unsure how to begin. "You came," Dakota said simply, straightening up. His voice was deep and quiet, carrying easily in the still air. "Yes," Clara gathered her courage. "I need to know about the treaty map you mentioned in town." Dakota studied her face for a long moment, as if weighing how much to share. Finally, he moved to a more sheltered spot between the walls, gesturing for her to follow. "The map shows boundaries," he explained, "marked by Army surveyors 15 years ago. It proves where Apache grazing lands end and settler claims begin, including your father's ranch." Clara frowned, processing this information. "But what does that have to do with the railroad?" "Everything." Dakota's dark eyes held hers. "The railroad men say our claims don't exist, that the land is open territory. But this map, signed by Army officers, shows otherwise. It proves both our rights to the land. That's why they're saying our deed won't hold up in court," Clara whispered, remembering the conversation she'd overheard in Silver Falls. "They're trying to void all the old claims." Dakota nodded grimly. "Unless a judge sees the treaty map, they'll push through wherever they please. My people will lose our grazing lands, and your family will lose the ranch." Clara wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the cold seep deeper than her bones. "Where is this map now?" "Safe, with my uncle." Dakota's expression softened slightly. "But getting it to a judge won't be easy. The railroad has friends in every town office." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling between them. A cold wind whistled through the mission's empty windows, carrying the promise of more snow. Clara thought of her father's stubborn pride, of May's quiet strength, of the ranch that had been her whole world. "We'll find a way," she said finally, surprising herself with the determination in her voice. "Both our families need this land. There must be someone who'll listen to the truth." Dakota's gaze sharpened with interest. "You'd help? Even against your father's wishes?" "The railroad men are the real threat," Clara replied. "Not you, not your people. I won't let them steal what rightfully belongs to either of us." A ghost of a smile touched Dakota's lips. "You're braver than you look, Clara Bennett." He glanced at the sky, noting the position of the sun. "We should go. Storm's coming, and your absence will be noticed." Clara nodded, but lingered for a moment. "How will I contact you again?" "Sam knows where to find me," Dakota said, already moving toward his horse. "Be careful who you trust with what you know. The railroad has ears everywhere." They mounted their horses, the animals sensing their rider's tension and stamping restlessly. Before they parted ways, Dakota turned in his saddle. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for believing me." Clara watched him ride away, his figure growing smaller against the winter landscape. The cold air filled her lungs as she took a deep breath, steeling herself for the ride home. She had chosen her path, and now a path that led away from the safety of blind obedience and towards something both frightening and right. The winter wind whistled through the mission's broken windows as Clara and Dakota finished discussing their plans. Snow had begun falling again, soft flakes catching in Clara's dark hair as she listened intently. "The map is with my uncle on the reservation," Dakota explained, his breath visible in the cold air. 2 days' ride south, if the weather holds." Clara straightened her spine, determination clear in her voice. "Then I'm going with you." Dakota's expression grew serious, his dark eyes studying her face. "The journey will be dangerous. Winter storms can trap travelers without warning. The passes fill with snow, and the nights are bitter cold. Without that map, the railroad will take everything," Clara countered, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. "My family's ranch, your people's grazing lands, all of it. The risk is worth it." Dakota was quiet for a long moment, watching the snow swirl between them. Finally, he nodded. "First light tomorrow. I'll bring extra horses for supplies." "I'll be here," Clara promised, already planning what she would need to pack. The ride home was cold but quick, with Clara urging Penny faster as the snow began falling harder. She reached the ranch just before supper, the kitchen windows glowing warmly in the gathering dusk. May looked up from the stove as Clara stamped snow from her boots. "Where have you been, child?" May asked, stirring a pot of beans. Clara brushed snow from her skirts, keeping her voice casual. "Riding fence line on the north pasture. Thought I saw some loose posts that needed checking before the next big storm." May nodded, though something in her eyes suggested she might not fully believe the story. Clara helped set the table, her mind already on tomorrow's journey as her father came in from the barn. That night, after the house grew quiet, Clara packed carefully by lamplight. She wrapped thick slices of bread and salt pork in a clean cloth, added strips of jerky from the smokehouse, and tucked in her warmest shawl. Her mother's old saddlebags would hold it all nicely. She laid out her heaviest coat and wool mittens, then tried to sleep, her heart beating fast with anticipation. Dawn broke pale and cold, the world outside her window painted in shades of gray and white. Clara dressed quickly, layer upon layer. Against the chill, she crept down the stairs, wincing at every creak, and slipped out through the kitchen door. The snow had stopped sometime in the night, leaving a fresh blanket over everything. Penny nickered softly as Clara saddled her in the dim barn. She led the horse out carefully, keeping to the shadows until she was past the house. Only then did she mount and turn Penny's head toward the river. Dakota waited at the mission ruins, just as promised. He had 3 horses with him, his own mount and 2 pack horses loaded with supplies. He nodded in greeting, his face serious. "Ready?" he asked simply. Clara squared her shoulders. "Yes." They set off along the frozen river, Dakota in the lead. The horses' hooves crunched through the crusty snow, their breath steaming in the morning air. Clara watched Dakota's broad back, noting how he constantly scanned the horizon and checked the sky. He clearly knew these trails well. The day passed in steady travel, broken only by brief stops to rest the horses and eat some jerky. Dakota pointed out landmarks, a lightning-struck pine, a distinctive rock formation, places where the trail might be treacherous. Clara listened carefully, knowing such knowledge could be vital. As the winter sun began to sink, Dakota led them off the main trail into a sheltered hollow. Tall pines surrounded a small clearing, their branches offering some protection from the wind. He helped Clara dismount, then began efficiently setting up camp. "The horses need tending first," he explained, showing her how to brush the snow from their coats and check their hooves for ice. They worked together to get the animals comfortable, then Dakota built a small fire while Clara spread blankets near it. Snowflakes began drifting down again as they sat close to the flames, sharing bread and jerky. The firelight cast dancing shadows on the snow around them, and Clara found herself relaxing despite the cold. "My mother taught me about horses," Dakota said suddenly, his voice soft but clear in the quiet night. She could gentle the wildest stallion with just her presence. She said horses know what's in your heart. They can sense fear or kindness. Clara watched his face as he spoke, seeing the love and pride there. "She sounds remarkable." She was. Dakota added a small branch to the fire. "She taught me that training horses isn't about breaking their spirit, but about building trust, understanding." He glanced at Clara. Like people, they remember who treats them with respect. A warmth spread through Clara's chest that had nothing to do with the fire. She pulled her blanket closer, hiding her smile. "My mother loved horses too," she offered quietly. "I barely remember her, but I know that much." They fell into comfortable silence, the night filled with the sound of wind in the pines and the soft nickering of the horses. When it was time to sleep, they arranged their blankets near but not touching, the fire between them and the horses creating a wall against the cold. Clara lay awake for a while, watching snowflakes spiral down through the firelight. The enormity of what they were attempting finally began to sink in 2 days' ride to the reservation, convincing Dakota's uncle to trust her with the map, then somehow getting it to a judge who would listen. Yet somehow, lying here in this quiet hollow with Dakota's steady presence nearby, it all seemed possible. She drifted off to sleep with the taste of wood, smoke in the air, and the sound of Dakota's even breathing mixing with the whisper of the wind through the trees. The second morning dawned harsh and bitter. Clara pulled her scarf tighter against the cutting westerly wind as they broke camp. Her muscles ached from the previous day's ride, but she kept pace with Dakota without complaint as they continued south. "Storm's coming," Dakota observed, studying the steel-gray clouds massing on the horizon. "We'll need shelter before nightfall." The wind grew sharper as the day wore on, carrying the bite of coming snow. Clara's cheeks stung, and her fingers grew numb despite her thick mittens. Dakota led them steadily through stands of pine and across frozen meadows. Always checking the sky dot by mid-afternoon, he pointed to a simple structure nestled against a rocky outcrop. "Trapper's line shack," he explained. "We can wait out the weather there." The rough-hewn cabin was small but solid, with a stone fireplace and stacked firewood along one wall. Dakota moved efficiently, caring for the horses while Clara swept old ashes from the hearth. Inside his saddlebag, he produced a twist of tobacco, which he placed carefully on a wooden shelf. "For those who keep this place," he explained, seeing Clara's questioning look. "They stock wood, leave supplies. It's only right to give something in return." Clara nodded, understanding. Out here, such unspoken exchanges could mean the difference between life and death. The wind howled outside as they shared a simple meal of jerky and the last of their bread. Clara watched Dakota tend the fire, his movements sure and practiced. He seemed different here in the wilderness, more at ease, as if the constraints of town life had fallen away. They set out again once the wind eased, though the cold remained fierce. The landscape began to change, the steep mountain terrain gradually giving way to rolling plains. By late afternoon, Clara noticed subtle markers, rock cairns, blazed trees that seemed to hold meaning for Dakota. "We're nearing the reservation boundary," he said quietly. "My uncle's camp is just ahead." The sun was setting when they finally approached a well-built log cabin, smoke curling from its chimney. Several horses grazed in a nearby corral, their winter coats thick and shaggy. A tall figure emerged from the cabin door. Dakota's uncle, J.V.E.Y.O. Clara remembered him from the livery stable in Silver Falls, but now she could study him properly. He was older than her father, with deep lines around his eyes and silver threading. His dark hair. He carried himself with quiet dignity, and his gaze was sharp and assessing as they dismounted. "Welcome," he said simply, inclining his head. His English was clear and precise. "Come inside where it's warm." The cabin's interior was neat and comfortable, with woven blankets on the walls and a pot of coffee warming on the wood stove. Chevio gestured for them to sit at a sturdy table, pouring the coffee into tin cups. "Dakota has told me of your journey," he said, studying Clara's face, "and why you seek the treaty map." Clara wrapped her cold fingers around the warm cup. "Railroad means to take both our lands, sir. Without proof of the original boundaries, we'll have no way to stop them." Chevio nodded slowly. "I remember when that map was drawn. I was there, translating for the army officers." He rose and went to a beautifully carved wooden chest in the corner. They made many promises that day. From the chest, he carefully withdrew a rolled document, bringing it to the table. Clara held her breath as he unrolled it, weighing down the corners with smooth stones. The paper was yellowed but well preserved, the ink lines still clear and dark. "Here," Chevio traced, a line with his finger, "is where the Bennett Ranch meets the Apache grazing lands. The Army acknowledged them as one connected claim, each depending on the other." His finger moved to show the natural boundaries: river, ridgeline, ancient buffalo trail. "The railroad men will try to say these marks mean nothing, but a judge who respects the old ways will understand." Clara leaned forward, memorizing every detail. The map showed what she'd always felt, that the land itself didn't recognize the artificial divisions people tried to impose. The ranch and reservation were part of one whole, bound together by geography and history. "You must guard it carefully," Chevio warned, beginning to roll the map again. "There are those who would destroy it rather than let its truth be known." After a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Chevio showed Clara to a bedroll near the fire. Despite her physical exhaustion, sleep was slow to come. She lay awake, listening to the wind outside and the soft murmur of Apache words as uncle and nephew spoke in low voices. Her thoughts drifted to the map and what it represented, not just boundaries on paper, but a connection between two worlds. Like the land itself, their fates were intertwined. Her father's stubborn prejudices seemed small and petty. Against the larger truth the map revealed. Morning brought a breakfast of hot cornmeal mush sweetened with wild honey. Clara watched Dakota and his uncle prepare the map, carefully wrapping it in oilcloth to protect it from weather. The simple domesticity of the scene touched her. 3 people sharing a meal, united in purpose despite their different backgrounds. As they readied the horses for departure, Saveo pressed a small packet of dried meat and corn into Clara's hands. "For the journey," he said simply. "Travel safely." Clara met his eyes, seeing wisdom and maybe a hint of approval there. "Thank you," she said softly, meaning not just for the food, but for trusting her with something so precious to his people. Morning was clear and cold as they mounted up, the precious map secured in Dakota's saddlebags. Clara turned in her saddle for one last look at the cabin, at Chevio standing in the doorway. She had come seeking a document but had found something more, a glimpse of how things could be when people chose understanding over fear. Gray clouds hung low over the mountains as Clara and Dakota began their journey home. The air held that peculiar stillness that often preceded snow, and their horses' hooves crunched against the frozen ground. Clara kept one hand near her saddlebag, reassured by the precious treaty map's presence. "Weather's turning," Dakota observed, his eyes scanning the heavy sky. The wind had picked up, carrying the first few scattered snowflakes. They rode steadily through the morning, the temperature dropping with each passing hour. By midday, the snow fell in earnest, thick, wet flakes that stuck to their clothes and made the horses' footing treacherous. Clara pulled her scarf tighter, but the cold still found its way through. Dakota reined his horse closer to hers. "There's another line shack ahead," he said, his voice carrying over the wind. "We should wait out the worst of it." Clara nodded, grateful. Her fingers had grown numb despite her thick gloves, and her mare was struggling against the strengthening. Gusts. The line shack appeared through the curtain of snow, a simple wooden structure tucked against a stand of pines. Dakota helped Clara dismount, then led the horses to the shelter of a lean-to while she pushed open the cabin's stiff door. Inside, the air was musty but dry. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and rough-hewn furniture, a table, 2 chairs, and a narrow cot filled the single room. Clara brushed snow from her skirts while Dakota brought in their saddlebags and started gathering kindling. Soon, a small fire crackled in the hearth, pushing back the cold and shadows. Clara sat close to its warmth, watching Dakota move about the cabin with quiet efficiency. He checked the windows, secured the shutters against the wind, and laid out the remaining provisions on the table. The storm's fury grew outside, but inside, the atmosphere felt almost peaceful. Clara found herself studying Dakota's profile in the firelight, wondering about the life he'd led. "How do you bear it?" she asked suddenly. He looked up from stoking the fire. "Bear what?" "The way people treat you in town." The suspicion, the sideways looks. She wrapped her arms around her knees. "It isn't right." Dakota was quiet for a long moment, adding another piece of wood to the flames. "By knowing who I am," he said finally, his voice steady. "My mother taught me that a man's worth isn't measured by others' fear or ignorance." Clara absorbed his words, thinking of her own sheltered upbringing. "Your mother sounds wise." She was. A small smile touched his lips. "She would have liked you." The wind rattled the shutters, but Clara barely noticed. The cabin felt like a world apart, where the usual barriers between them seemed less substantial. She watched as Dakota pulled dried meat and a few biscuits from his pack, sharing them equally between 2 tin plates. They ate in comfortable silence, and Clara found herself relaxing despite the storm's howl. When Dakota spoke again, his voice was lighter, telling her about the time his young cousin tried to ride a particularly stubborn pony and ended up in a mud puddle instead. Clara laughed, surprised and delighted by this glimpse of humor. The sound seemed to fill the small cabin, making the space feel warmer somehow. Dakota's eyes crinkled at the corners, and she realized how rarely she'd seen him truly smile. "Thank you," she said softly, after their laughter had faded. "For what? For helping us. For risking yourself to save my family's land." She met his gaze across the firelight. "You didn't have to." Dakota set aside his plate, his expression growing serious. "Perhaps I did. Some things are worth the risk." The air between them seemed to change, becoming charged with unspoken meaning. Clara's heart beat faster as Dakota moved closer, his dark eyes intent on her face. When he reached out to touch her cheek, his fingers were surprisingly gentle. The kiss, when it came, was as careful as his touch, slow and reverent, as if he were memorizing every moment. Clara closed her eyes, feeling the last of her old fears fall away. She had spent so long behind her father's fences, seeing the world through his narrow view. But here, in this storm-besieged cabin with Dakota, she felt truly free for the first time. When they finally drew apart, the fire had burned lower, casting soft shadows on the walls. Neither spoke for a long moment, but the silence was comfortable. Full of new understanding, they shared the narrow cot that night, wrapped in their blankets with proper distance between them. The wind's voice grew softer, and Clara drifted to sleep, listening to Dakota's steady breathing nearby. Morning brought clear skies and a world transformed by snow. Everything glittered in the early light as they prepared to leave, checking their gear and the precious map. Clara swung into her saddle, settling the map securely in her saddlebag. They rode side by side now, their horses breaking trail through the fresh snow. Clara breathed in the crisp air, feeling strangely light despite the challenges that still lay ahead. The territory was familiar, they would reach Bennett Land by nightfall, but she was no longer the same person who had left it. She glanced at Dakota, riding tall and steady beside her, and smiled. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Silver Falls Main Street as Clara and Dakota rode into town. Their horses' hooves clattered against the packed dirt, drawing curious glances from townsfolk on the boardwalk. Clara sat straight in her saddle despite her weariness, the precious treaty map secure in her saddlebag. Dakota rode beside her, his expression relaxed until they rounded the corner near the general store. A crowd had gathered outside the jail, their murmuring voices carrying on the cold air. Sheriff Wade Morton stood on the steps, his badge catching the late sunlight. "Something's wrong," Dakota said quietly, his body tensing. Before Clara could respond, the sheriff strode toward them, his hand resting on his gun belt. Two deputies flanked him, their faces grim. "Dakota," Morton called out, "step down from that horse." Clara's heart jumped. "Sheriff Morton, what's this about?" The sheriff barely glanced at her. "Got a complaint from Silas McGraw, the railroad foreman. Says you stole 3 horses from the company corral 2 nights ago." "That's impossible," Clara protested, her voice sharp with disbelief. "He's been with me, Miss Bennett," Morton cut her off. "This doesn't concern you." He gestured to his deputies. "Get him down." The crowd pressed closer as the deputies approached. Dakota's face remained calm, but Clara saw his hands tighten on the reins. After a moment's hesitation, he dismounted smoothly, his movements deliberate. "The horses are mine," he said, his voice steady. "Purchased fair from the Tucson trader last spring. We'll sort that out in court." Morton nodded to his deputies, who grabbed Dakota's arms. "Search him." Clara watched helplessly as they pulled Dakota's knife from his belt. When Morton approached her horse, she instinctively clutched her saddlebag closer. "Hand it over, Miss Bennett. All his belongings are evidence now." "This has nothing to do with," she began, but Morton reached up and yanked the bag free. The treaty map tumbled out with her other possessions. Well, Morton said, scooping up the oilcloth-wrapped document. "What's this?" Clara's throat tightened. "That's private property. You have no right. Everything goes to evidence." Morton tucked the map under his arm and turned away. "Take him inside." Clara scrambled down from her horse, pushing through the crowd as the deputies marched Dakota toward the jail. Their eyes met briefly before he disappeared through the heavy door. His expression held a warning, "Stay calm, be careful. Be careful." Clara watched helplessly as they pulled Dakota's knife from his belt. When Morton approached her horse, she instinctively clutched her saddlebag closer. "Hand it over, Miss Bennett. All his belongings are evidence now." "This has nothing to do with," she began, but Morton reached up and yanked the bag free. The treaty map tumbled out with her other possessions. Well, Morton said, scooping up the oilcloth-wrapped document. "What's this?" Clara's throat tightened. "That's private property. You have no right. Everything goes to evidence." Morton tucked the map under his arm and turned away. "Take him inside." Clara scrambled down from her horse, pushing through the crowd as the deputies marched Dakota toward the jail. Their eyes met briefly before he disappeared through the heavy door. His expression held a warning, stay calm, be careful. The crowd dispersed slowly, their whispers following Clara as she led both horses to the livery. Her hands shook as she paid for their care. The stable boy avoided her eyes. At the boarding house, Mrs. Peterson clucked disapprovingly but gave Clara a room. Your reputation to risk, girl, she muttered, handing over the key. Clara paced the small room as evening settled over the town. Finally, she sent Sam, who had followed them into town, to the telegraph office. Her message to her father was brief. Dakota arrested on false charges. Please come. Clara, sleep proved impossible. She lay awake in the narrow bed, watching moonlight crawl across the floor, her mind racing through possibilities. The treaty map was their only proof against the railroad's plans. Without it, morning brought heavy footsteps in the hallway. Her father burst through the door without knocking, his face thunderous. Of all the foolish, reckless, Amos Bennett's voice shook with anger. Running off with that Apache? Have you lost your mind? Clara stood her ground. Father, listen. The railroad means to take our land. Dakota was helping. Helping? Amos spat the word. He's helping destroy everything I've built. The whole town's talking about my daughter riding alone with him for days. The charges are false, Clara insisted. The railroad foreman fabricated. Enough. Amos slammed his hand against the wall. You'll stay silent in court. Not one word about where you've been or what you've done. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. But without my testimony, they'll convict him. Father, please, listen carefully. Amos stepped closer, his voice low and hard. You speak up in that courtroom, you're no longer my daughter. No home. No inheritance. No family. Is that clear? Clara stared at her father, really seeing him for the first time, seeing the fear beneath his anger, the walls he'd built around their lives. In that moment, she understood that her choice was about more than just Dakota or the treaty map. It was about who she would become. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze steadily. Crystal clear, Father. Amos searched her face, perhaps recognizing. Something had shifted between them. Without another word, he turned and strode out, leaving the door open behind him. Clara sank onto the bed, her hands pressed against her heart. The choice lay before her like a fork in the trail, safety and silence down one path, truth and justice down the other. Through the window, she could see the jail where Dakota waited, trusting her to do what was right. The matter wasn't just about keeping their lands anymore. It was about standing up for what was true, even when the cost was terribly high. The Silver Falls courthouse stood like a weathered sentinel in the crisp morning air. Inside, wooden benches creaked under the weight of what seemed like half the town. Dust motes danced in pale sunlight streaming through tall windows, catching on the polished oak of the judge's bench. Clara sat near the back, her hands twisted in her lap. She watched as ranchers filed in, their boots leaving trails of snow on the plank floor. A cluster of Apache men entered silently, taking places along the rear wall. Their presence straightened Clara's spine. They had come to support Dakota. Judge Harrison Miller adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles, his lined face stern beneath graying hair. Court is now in session, he announced, voice cutting through the murmurs. The territory brings charges of horse theft against Dakota, no surname given. Dakota stood at the defendant's table, his shoulders squared. Even in custody, he carried himself with quiet dignity. Clara's heart ached at the sight of his bound hands. Silas McGraw, the railroad foreman, swaggered to the witness stand. His neat suit and polished boots spoke of money, while his thin smile suggested a man used to getting his way. 3 horses, Your Honor, McGraw declared, smoothing his mustache. Fine stock, marked with the railroad company brand. Found in the defendant's possession 2 nights ago. That's a lie, Clara whispered, her nails digging into her palms. McGraw's testimony continued, smooth as creek ice. He described the stolen horses in detail, produced documentation of railroad ownership, and spoke of Dakota's suspicious behavior near the company corrals. And you're certain these were company horses? The judge asked. Clear as day, Your Honor. McGraw's confidence filled the room. Our brand, our stock, plain and simple. Clara's breath came faster as the judge nodded thoughtfully. She glanced At her father, who sat rigid in the front row, his back a wall of warning. Does anyone wish to present further evidence in this matter? Judge Miller's gaze swept the courtroom. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. The moment stretched like pulled taffy, sweet and painful. She thought of Dakota's gentle hands with horses, his quiet strength, the way he'd wrapped her in his buffalo robe during the storm. She thought of the treaty map, still held in evidence, and all it meant for both their families. Her legs shook. As she stood, Clara. Her father's harsh whisper carried in the sudden quiet. Sit down. She stepped into the aisle instead, chin lifted. Your Honor, I have evidence to present. Judge Miller peered at her over his spectacles. Step forward, Miss ... Bennett, Your Honor, Clara Bennett. A ripple of whispers washed through the gallery. Her father's face darkened like a thunderhead. Proceed, Miss Bennett. Clara walked to the front, each step steadier than the last. She faced the crowd, finding strength in Dakota's steady gaze. 2 days ago, Dakota was with me, she began, her voice clear despite its trembling. We had traveled to the Apache reservation to retrieve an important document, treaty map showing the legal boundaries of both Bennett ranch lands and Apache grazing territory. The whispers grew louder. Judge Miller rapped his gavel once. This map, Clara continued, was made when the Army first established the reservation. It proves that the railroad's planned route ignores legal property lines that have stood for decades. Your Honor, McGraw interrupted, standing. This has nothing to do with the theft charges. It has everything to do with them, Clara countered. These false charges were brought only after Dakota helped me obtain proof that could stop the railroad from taking our lands. She described their journey in detail, the winter trails, the nights in line checks, Dakota's uncle, and the maps. History. With each word, her voice grew stronger. The horses McGraw claims were stolen? They belonged to Dakota. I saw him use them on our ranch last spring, long before the railroad ever came to Silver Falls. Behind her, she heard the courthouse door slam. Through the window, she glimpsed her father storming down the street, his coat billowing in the wind. The sight sent pain through her chest, but she pressed on. Dakota is a man of honor, she said, her voice catching. He saved my life in the past during the storm. He's helped my father with horse training for years. He would never steal. It goes against everything he believes. The gallery had grown still, every eye fixed on her. Even the Apache men had leaned forward, their faces intent. Your Honor, she finished, I ask that you examine the treaty map. It will show the truth about the railroad's plans and about the kind of man Dakota truly is. Judge Miller stroked his chin thoughtfully. Bailiff, bring me the map from evidence. The oilskin wrapper crackled as the judge carefully unrolled the document. The courtroom waited in tense silence as he studied the faded lines and careful notations. Finally, he looked up. This matter requires careful consideration. Court will recess until tomorrow morning while I examine this evidence. His gavel cracked against wood. Dismissed. The gallery erupted in conversation as people stood. Clara's legs felt weak, but she held herself straight, refusing to show fear. She caught Dakota's eye as the bailiff led him away. The ghost of a smile touched his lips, pride and gratitude in equal measure. Outside, the winter sun had risen high, making the snow gleam. Clara stood on the courthouse steps, watching townsfolk disperse in clusters of animated discussion. Her father was nowhere in sight. The weight of his absence pressed against her shoulders, but she lifted her face to the clean, cold air. She had chosen truth over silence, justice over safety. Whatever came next, she would face it knowing she had done what was right. What was right. The sound of the judge's chamber door closing echoed through the now empty courthouse as Clara finally turned to leave. Waiting for tomorrow's verdict with both hope and trepidation in her heart, Clara paced the weathered boardwalk outside the courthouse, her boots making hollow sounds against the wooden planks. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Silver Falls Main Street, and her breath formed small clouds in the crisp air. A few townspeople lingered nearby, speaking in hushed tones about the morning's testimony. The jail door creaked open, and Deputy Wilson emerged with Dakota. 5 minutes, the deputy said gruffly, but there was less hostility in his voice than before. Dakota stepped onto the boardwalk, his hands still bound but his bearing proud. Clara moved toward him, conscious of the watching eyes from the mercantile across the street. "You didn't have to do that," Dakota said softly. "Standing up to your father, speaking out in court, that took courage." Clara shook her head. "I only told the truth. Truth itself takes courage sometimes." His dark eyes met hers steadily. "You're braver than you know, Clara Bennett." The simple words warmed her more than any fire could. Before she could respond, Deputy Wilson appeared to escort Dakota back inside. The afternoon stretched endlessly. Clara sat on a bench outside the courthouse, refusing all suggestions that she wait at the boarding house. The sun had begun its descent behind the western peaks when Judge Miller's clerk hurried out, announcing court would reconvene. Inside, the gallery filled quickly. Clara noticed several faces that hadn't been present for the morning session, including Martha Webb from the telegraph office and old Jim Tucker, who ran the livery. The judge entered, his expression unreadable as he took his seat. "After careful examination of the treaty map," Judge Miller began, his voice filling the hushed courtroom, "I find the document to be authentic and legally binding. The boundaries established therein are valid and must be respected by all parties, including the railroad company." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The judge raised his hand for silence. "Furthermore, regarding the charges against Dakota, I find no credible evidence of horse theft. The accusations appear to be—" He paused, giving McGraw a stern look. Without merit. Case dismissed." The sheriff's face flushed red as he fumbled with his keys, approaching Dakota to remove the shackles. The iron cuffs fell away with a clank that echoed in the quiet room. Silas McGraw shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is an outrage." "You can't." "That will be all, Mr. McGraw." Judge Miller cut him off sharply. "The railroad." Foreman stormed toward the door, shoving past onlookers. "This ain't finished," he muttered, loud enough for Clara to hear. "Not by a long shot." As people filed out of the courthouse, Clara watched McGraw march down the street toward the railroad office, his back rigid with anger. A knot of worry formed in her stomach. Men like him didn't accept defeat easily. The sun had set by the time the courthouse cleared. Clara found Dakota outside, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Without speaking, they fell into step together, walking away from the bustle of the town center. The evening air bit cold and clean, their boots crunching on packed snow. A few windows glowed warm in the gathering dusk, and somewhere distant, a dog barked at the rising moon. "The map needs to go back to my uncle," Dakota said finally. "He's its rightful keeper." Clara nodded, though her heart sank at the words. "When will you leave?" "Tomorrow at first light. The sooner it's safe with him, the better." They stopped at the edge of town, where the road turned to trail. The stars had multiplied overhead, bright and sharp in the winter sky. Clara pulled her shawl tighter, though the chill wasn't what made her shiver. "I don't want this to be goodbye," she said quietly, the words carrying in the still air. Dakota turned to face her, his expression soft in the starlight. "The reservation isn't so far," he said, "and I have reason to visit Silver Falls now and then." "For the horses?" Clara asked, though she knew that wasn't what he meant. A small smile touched his lips. "For the horses," he agreed. "And for other things worth riding half a day to see." Clara felt warmth bloom in her chest despite the cold. They stood in comfortable silence, watching their breath mingle in the freezing air, neither wanting to be the first to turn away. The town church bell tolled 8 times, the sound carrying clearly in the winter night. A reminder that even moments that feel suspended in time must eventually end. "I should get back to the boarding house," Clara said reluctantly. "Mrs. Potter will be wondering where I am." Dakota nodded. "I'll see you in the morning before I leave?" "Yes," she answered, and it felt like a promise of more than just tomorrow's meeting. "I'll be here." They walked back toward town, their steps unhurried despite the late hour. The stars wheeled overhead, constant and bright, as if bearing witness to something new taking root in the frozen ground of winter. The Bennett Ranch stood silent under a blanket of fresh snow, the morning sun casting long shadows across the crystalline landscape. Clara led her horse from the barn, the mare's hooves crunching in the packed snow of the yard. Her father stood on the porch, watching her morning routine without a word, his face set in hard lines that had become familiar over the Past few days since returning from Silver Falls, meals had become exercises in careful silence. Amos spoke only when necessity demanded it, addressing his request to May or focusing on his plate. Clara felt his disappointment like a physical weight, but she couldn't bring herself to regret standing up for what was right. The barn offered refuge from his stern gaze. Clara buried herself in work, checking harnesses for wear and oiling dried leather until it grew supple again. The familiar tasks kept her hands busy while her mind wandered to memories of starlit conversations and the warmth of Dakota's presence. By mid-morning, Martha Jensen from the neighboring ranch rode up, ostensibly to borrow some sugar. But her real purpose became clear as she lingered in the kitchen, praising Clara's courage in the courthouse. "It's about time someone stood up to those railroad men," Martha said, warming her hands around a cup of May's coffee. "My Thomas says they've been pushing folks around all up and down the valley." Clara noticed her father's shadow pass by the window, his footsteps heavy on the porch boards. Martha lowered her voice. "Don't you mind the sour faces, girl? You did. Right by both sides, settlers and natives alike." Throughout the week, more visitors appeared with similar words of support. Old Jim Tucker rode out with a wagon part Amos had ordered, staying longer than necessary to tell Clara how his own grandmother had been friends with the local tribes before the reservations. Even Reverend Wallace's wife stopped by, bringing a loaf of fresh bread and quiet words about following one's conscience. Each visitor seemed to draw Amos's mood darker, his jaw tighter. He took to eating in his study or riding the far pastures until after sunset. Clara felt his absence like a wound, remembering easier days when she'd been his little shadow, following him around the ranch and learning its ways. The only peace came in the evening hours spent with May in the kitchen. They worked side by side, kneading bread dough or mending clothes by lamplight. One particularly cold night, as they sealed preserves for winter, May broke their comfortable silence. "He's hurting," she said softly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Not just angry hurting. He thought he could keep you safe by keeping you close." Clara carefully wiped the rim of a jar before setting the lid. "I know, but I'm not a child anymore." "No," May agreed. "You're not. And that's part of what scares him." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I want you to know I'm proud of you. Standing up for what's right, even when it costs something, that takes real strength." Clara's eyes stung with sudden tears. "But you're worried too, aren't you? About Dakota." May moved to stand beside her, their shoulders touching. "Life won't be easy if you choose that path. Some folks will never understand. It might mean leaving everything you know." "I think Clara's voice wavered, then steadied. "I think I already chose, that night in the line shack. My heart knew. Before my head did." May wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. They stood that way for a long moment, the kitchen quiet except for the crack of the stove wood and the wind whistling under the eaves. The next morning dawned, clear and cold. Clara was collecting eggs when she heard hoofbeats in the yard. A young Apache rider sat tall in his saddle, waiting patiently by the gate. Her heart quickened as she recognized him as one of Dakota's cousins. He handed her a carefully folded paper, nodded respectfully, and wheeled his horse around without waiting for a reply. Clara's fingers trembled slightly as she opened the note. Recognizing Dakota's precise handwriting, "The small church in Silver Falls holds service each Sunday at 10 o'clock. If you can come this week, I will be there. This is not goodbye, it is a beginning. Dakota." Dakota. Clara pressed the paper to her chest, feeling the rapid beat of her heart against it. The possibility of seeing him again, even in the formal setting of a church service, made her breath catch. She tucked the note carefully in her pocket, already planning how to tell May she wanted to attend Sunday service in town. A sound made her look up. Her father stood in the barn doorway, his expression unreadable as he watched her. For a moment, their eyes met across the snow-covered yard. Clara lifted her chin slightly, refusing to look away or appear ashamed. After a long moment, Amos turned and walked heavily toward the house, his shoulders bent as if carrying an invisible weight. Clara touched the note in her pocket, drawing strength from its presence. The morning sun caught the fresh snow, making it sparkle like scattered diamonds across the ranch yard. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called, its clear song carrying hope on the winter air. May's words echoed in her mind, following ones. Heart came with the price. But as Clara walked back to the house, eggs gathered in her basket and Dakota's invitation safely tucked against her heart, she knew with bone-deep certainty that whatever the cost might be, she was ready to pay it. Sunday. Morning painted the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and rose. Clara stood before her mirror, fingers trembling as she pinned her hair. The blue wool shawl, a gift from her mother years ago, settled warmly around her shoulders. Its familiar weight gave her courage. May knocked softly on her door. "Ready, dear?" They took the wagon into Silver Falls, the wooden wheels crunching over frozen ruts. Clara's stomach fluttered with each mile marker they passed. May hummed hymns quietly, her presence steady and reassuring beside Clara on the wooden seat. The little white church glowed with lamplight against the morning shadows. Smoke curled from its brick chimney into the crystal-clear sky. Clara's heart skipped when she spotted Dakota's horse tied alongside others at the hitching post. Inside, warmth from the pot-bellied stove wrapped around them. The wooden pews were already filled with familiar faces, the Jensens, old Jim Tucker, Reverend Wallace's wife in her Sunday best. Whispered conversations hushed as Clara and May stepped through the door. Dakota sat near the front, his broad shoulders straight in a clean black coat. At the sound of their entrance, he rose and turned. Their eyes met across the chapel, and Clara felt the rest of the world fade away for a moment. He inclined his head in greeting, a small smile touching his lips. May squeezed Clara's arm gently, guiding her to a pew. The church filled with the sounds of rustling skirts and hymn books being opened. Reverend Wallace took his place at the simple wooden pulpit, his kind eyes sweeping over the congregation. His sermon seemed meant just for them, though Clara knew he'd likely planned it weeks ago. He spoke of love as an act of courage, of choosing faith over fear. True love, he said, his voice carrying to the rafters, requires us to look past the boundaries others have drawn. Clara felt each word resonate in her chest like the church. Bells toll. She sensed Dakota's presence ahead of her, solid and sure as the mountains themselves. A shadow fell across the doorway. Clara turned with the rest of the congregation to see her father standing there, his hat clutched in weathered hands. The morning light caught the silver in his hair as he stepped inside. The silence stretched taut as a fiddle string. Then Amos cleared his throat. "Dakota," he said, his voice rough but clear. "Reckon I owe you words that are long overdue." Dakota stood, turning to face him. The two men regarded each other across the chapel. "Any man who'd risk his neck for my girl deserves my respect," Amos continued. "I misjudged you, and I'm sorry for it." Dakota nodded solemnly, his dark eyes steady. "Your words honor me, Mr. Bennett." The tension broke like ice in spring thaw. Reverend Wallace beamed as Amos crossed to shake Dakota's hand. Quiet murmurs of approval rippled through the congregation. Mrs. Wallace dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Clara felt tears of joy spring to her own eyes as she stood to join them. May's hand pressed warmly against her back. For the first time in weeks, she could stand beside Dakota openly, without fear or shame. The morning sun streamed through the church windows, painting everything in gentle light. The evening service ended with a final hymn that seemed to linger in the crisp winter air. One by one, families filed out of the warm church into the gathering dusk, their breath visible in small clouds. Clara noticed how different everything looked now. The same buildings and streets she'd known all her life somehow fresher, more alive in the soft glow spilling from the church windows. Dakota stood near the steps, his broad figure outlined against the lamplight streaming through frosted window panes. He waited patiently as Clara said goodbye to May, who smiled knowingly before climbing into the wagon where Amos waited. Clara's boots crunched in the fresh snow as she approached Dakota. Her heart felt so full it might burst. Everything that had seemed impossible just weeks ago now felt as natural as breathing. She reached for his hand, her fingers twining with his roughened ones. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they came from joy rather than fear or loneliness. "I trust you," she whispered, the words carrying all the weight of that first night in the cave when he'd saved her life. The memory of wind howling outside, while they shared warmth and whispered promises, seemed both distant and immediate. Dakota's dark eyes softened as he gazed down at her. His free hand came up to brush her cheek, just as it had that night. Always, he replied, his voice deep and sure. There, in the lamplight with townsfolk still milling about, he bent and kissed her. The touch of his lips was tender, unhurried. Clara felt the last walls around her heart crumble away. This wasn't a hidden moment in a storm or a secret shared in whispers. This was their truth, witnessed by all. Snow began falling in lazy spirals around them as they finally parted. Small flakes caught in Dakota's dark hair and on Clara's shawl as they walked together toward the hitching post where their horses waited. The sound of their boots in the snow mingled with the gentle conversations of departing churchgoers. Behind them, Amos's familiar heavy tread approached. "Dakota," he called, his voice carrying none of its old harshness. "Been thinking about that south pasture fence. Come spring, we ought to shore it up proper." Clara felt Dakota's hand squeeze hers gently as he turned to respond. "Yes, sir, I know just the timber we could use." The church bells began to toll, their deep notes rolling out across the quiet street. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over her. No more hiding away in the ranch house, no more avoiding townsfolk's stares. Here, walking between the man she loved and the father who'd finally opened his heart, she was exactly where she belonged. If something in this story whispered to your spirit, stay a while. Subscribe and come back tomorrow. The next story may be the one you didn't know you needed.